for coming tonight. It's good to see some friendly faces in the audience. I'm sure the rest of you are just as friendly as well. And it is a very great honour to have been asked by the MBI Al-Jaber Foundation to speak in this very distinguished series of lectures. Though I must say I do feel something of a fraud when I look at the other speakers, all of whom are very highly regarded experts on the Middle East. There is a condition known as imposter syndrome, to which academics and would-be academics are particularly prone, and I suspect that accounts for some of my feelings. But there's also a more particular reason too. I make no great claim to be an expert on the Middle East. My own research interest has always been political opposition in democratic systems, with a primary focus on the UK. And it was the absence of any great research in that field that led me to embark on my PhD thesis on British opposition, and to then establish the Centre for Opposition Studies. It always seemed quite odd to me that you have whole government departments, or whole university departments, and think tanks devoted to the study of government, but there's no equivalent dedicated study of political opposition. In my eyes, that means that we are very often missing at least half the picture, and very often a lot more. In any established democratic system of government, the opposition is at least as important to understanding the process of politics and governance as those in power. Having set up the centre with that in mind, our work took a rather different turn. I had expected to be engaged in a fairly defined examination of British opposition, looking at the many issues that affect its operation and effectiveness. Whilst that is an important part of our work, our chairman, Professor Mohammed Abdul Haq, quickly realised that there was much more the centre could do. As a British Jordanian, he was seized with how profound a concept is what we in the UK have come to call loyal opposition. We are in this country so used to it as a concept that we've perhaps become rather blasé about it. But as he pointed out, when applied to many overseas political systems, and to the Middle East perhaps in particular, it takes on a much greater significance. He felt, as did I when I considered it, that many of the challenges of governance in the region could be understood in large part by looking at the role that opposition does, or indeed does not play, in their political system. So we began to widen the centre's focus, and to look at how we could apply our work to those challenges too. Now that was in mid-2010. Later that year, a young Tunisian street vendor, driven to despair by state corruption and harassment, set himself on fire outside a regional government office. The protest that followed sparked the Tunisian revolution and the fall of President Ben Ali in early 2011, and provided a catalyst for what has become known as the Arab Spring, which I think is far too tranquil a metaphor for the whirlwind that's continued to blow through the region, making more stark than ever the challenges that already existed. Suddenly, the role of opposition was not just an abstract subject for academic discussion. It was actually a pressing foreign policy problem. I'll always remember television correspondents standing in the streets of Libya, Egypt, or Syria being asked by their colleagues in the studio, so what do we know about these opposition groups? Who are they? The same questions were, we know, being asked fairly urgently in many Western foreign ministries. But whilst those may have been the urgent questions, properly understanding the challenges of the region and the forces at work in the uprisings required, and still requires, a more fundamental consideration of the idea of opposition. Now, when we talk of the opposition here in the UK, it seems to us a fairly straightforward term. We're familiar with the concept of a peaceful parliamentary opposition and how it fits into our political system. But it's worth remembering that getting to the position we're in now has been far from easy or quick. As commemorations of the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta this year remind us, it took many centuries, much bloodshed, political turmoil, and full-scale civil war to get anywhere near our current political settlement. And that's a point I'm always keen to make before presuming to offer any advice to countries in the Middle East. Ours was not a smooth or peaceful process, and if nothing else, they should aim to learn from our many mistakes. Neither do I make any pretense that our system is perfect, or a model to be directly copied. With the United Kingdom having only just survived a real threat to its very existence in the form of the Scottish referendum, it would be rather odd to claim all is fine with our settled constitution. Add to that the fact our Parliament endured a highly damaging expenses scandal not so long ago, voter disenchantment with established parties, fueling support for nationalist movements, and the fact we face the likelihood of another inconclusive general election. And those are just the obvious examples. So the UK's political system has some real challenges, but amid all of that, the basic principle that the opposition is an integral part of our democratic arrangements is firmly established. It's part of the furniture, along with Parliament, parties, government departments, and the monarchy. And it's worth mentioning the monarchy in this context, as we sometimes refer formally to Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition. And we use that to describe what is otherwise known as just the official opposition. But both those titles are important in what they say about the status and the activity of opposition here in the UK. They reflect the fact that we accept it as an institution in its own right. Professor Lord Norton of Louth, that great authority on Parliament, who I'm pleased to say is on our advisory board, defines it as a constitutional opposition, which is a useful term to which I'll return shortly. Opposition itself, however, is a concept that needs no official recognition to sustain it. And I want to dwell on that wider concept for a moment. Wherever politicians and rulers make decisions, there will usually exist some measure of dissent from them. The very process of politics, being a mechanism for conflict resolution in society, assumes its existence. If all humankind always agreed on the exact course of action to be taken, there would be no need for structures of governance and decision-making. We would live in some sort of harmonious anarchy. The fact that we have developed power structures and governments, let alone democracy, shows that there is a need for settling differences between opposing views. Some degree of opposition, therefore, is embedded in society. There will almost always be some people who dissent from a decision made and maintain that opinion despite accepting, or being forced to accept, the conclusion that's been reached. Some may dissent from nearly everything that a ruler does, and eventually start to oppose not just the decisions, but the decision makers' right to make them at all. Such opposition to political rulings and to political rulers will always exist to some extent. The crucial point, and one which I'm always at pains to stress to our international partners and visitors, is that it's not an optional extra. Opposition is not something that you choose to allow, it is a fact. The question is simply, or not so simply, how is it manifested in a state? The challenge to any system of government, indeed the challenge of all politics, is how to manage that inevitable conflict of views and the resulting pressures. We know that at its most basic it can be resolved through force. The supporters of different views or different rulers will fight one another, and the winner claims the right to impose their will and rule over the others. There's certainly plenty of experience of that in British history, and it remains too often the means for conflict resolution across the world, including, of course, in the Middle East. The uprisings that occurred in the Arab Spring are, of course, an effective illustration of what happens when opposition is not properly accepted and accommodated within a political system. It doesn't simply go away, no matter how forcibly it's suppressed. You can ban protests, but you cannot stop people from opposing in their hearts and minds. Eventually, such dissent will find expression, and if it cannot find its expression in Parliament, it will usually find expression on the streets, with highly unpredictable and dangerous results. Returning to British history, I've already alluded to the many battles that took place in the past between rivals for the crown, our very own Game of Thrones, if you'll forgive me. Such a dramatic form of changing government did at least have the benefit of relative clarity. It was fairly obvious to all who triumphed and who had been defeated. Just ask Richard III, who of course has been buried in Leicester in a couple of months. But in between such absolute conflicts, any dissent from the will of a king was ruthlessly suppressed as treason tinged with heresy. True opposition could not find its expression under the rule of an absolute monarch, maintaining their divine right to rule. This interplay between sovereign power and religious absolutism also has some relevance to the Arab world, of course. The highly traumatic experience of the English Civil War and the subsequent execution of a king clearly had a lasting effect on the development of our constitutional system. Avoiding such a horror can be viewed as a powerful motivator for the emergence of greater tolerance and willingness to find compromise on both sides. The constitutional settlement that we've reached gradually over time, and stemming in large part from that conflict, has been one in which opposition in Parliament is accepted as right and proper. But what's important to note, and what makes the concept of loyal opposition so interesting, is how relatively open political debate and free speech came to exist without requiring the position of the monarch to be challenged. Initially, this caused serious problems for democratic thinkers. How could you tell His Majesty's government that they were wrong and that what they were doing was damaging, without implying criticism of His Majesty for having chosen and supported that government? That very issue is a major obstacle to development of effective opposition in a number of countries in the Middle East, and such questions have driven many theories and discourses on opposition over the years and remain relevant in new configurations today. But before addressing them, we first need to consider further the basic question of definition. As the concept of opposition is such a broad one, attempts at a useful definition for the purpose of political study often encounter difficulty, and this is something that's caused problems for much greater minds than mine. As our friend Philip Norton puts it, it is taken as intrinsic to a democratic society, yet it is a nebulous concept. Geoffrey Ponton, in his book Political Opposition, noted, its meaning is widely assumed to be self-evident, when in fact it's often obscure or a confused jumble of several ill-differentiated meanings. He went on to argue that amongst political terms that are taken so much for granted as to be hardly noticed, opposition is one which particularly asks to be studied, given the disparity between its professed importance and the relative lack of attention that it's received. The great American academic Robert A. Dahl agreed that the word is rather difficult to define precisely, adding that this is not unusual with key terms in social theory, though it is often annoying. His first attempt at a definition of his own is not, by his own admission, very helpful. He asks us to suppose that A determines the conduct of some aspect of the government of a particular political system during some interval, and suppose that during this interval B cannot determine the conduct of government, and that B is opposed to the conduct of government by A. The B is what we mean by the opposition. Which is true enough, I suppose, but as he conceded, this highly abstract definition need not be taken too seriously. It was Rodney Barker, now Emeritus Professor of Government down the road at the LSE, who identified the biggest problem with these definitions. He noted that unfortunately some writers have treated the different meanings of opposition as if they were different aspects of the same phenomenon, instead of different though related phenomena expressed by the same word. One related observation he went on to make struck me as having particular relevance to our subject this evening. He wrote that in some African languages, the confusion is exacerbated by the word for opposition deriving from the word for enmity. In English, we have no such excuse. And whilst he highlights African languages, similar issues of confused meaning can clearly also apply to Arabic or Farsi, as we at the Centre have discovered in our international project work. The unwieldy nature of any attempted definition is explained in large part by the fact that opposition infuses society and all of its politics, a contention for which there's a wealth of supporting literature. J.S. Mill, in his most famous work on liberty, accepts opposition as inherent in political systems, describing early civilizations where the rulers were conceived as in necessarily antagonistic position to the people whom they ruled. Robert Dahl begins with the same premise when he makes what he acknowledges is the obvious assumption that no government receives indefinitely the total support of the people over whom it asserts its jurisdiction, and that given the existence of disagreements as to what the government should do, that is to say the human condition, even an egalitarian democracy cannot respond fully to the preferences of both the greater number and the smaller number who disagree with them.